This is H.D. Ingles again, and I want to present to you another episode of Fascinating Facts, of course, broadcast on the RU Nuts Network. Just for a little prelude here, the end of the Articles of Confederation was marked by Shays' Rebellion, which was a tax protest by Western Massachusetts farmers in 1786 and 1787, and proved that the central government could not put down an internal rebellion. This gave birth to our Constitution. This episode is about the first true challenge to federal authority under the Constitution, which occurred during the first term of President George Washington. Here goes. The Whiskey Rebellion. Firstly, some basic information. The value of a $1790. $1 in 1790 had the power of about $35 today, which means that 1 cent had much more value in 1790. Now, 1790 average earnings. According to historian John Bach McMaster, average earnings in the 1790s was $65 a year, with food and perhaps lodging. In other words, 1 cent was fairly serious money. Now an overview. By 1791, Revolutionary War debt was forcing a heavy burden on the United States. In January 1791, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton proposed an excise tax on spirits distilled within the United States. This was the first such tax ever enacted on a domestic product. Now, over objections from anti-federalists such as Thomas Jefferson, Congress passed the legislation. Now, it was a tilted tax. Large producers paid the tax annually at a rate of 6 cents per gallon, which decreased with increased production. But small producers were obliged to pay the maximum 9 cents per gallon in taxes. And remember, a cent was a few bucks. Another problem, farmers in the more populated eastern areas could sell their grain crops with no major problems. On the other hand, frontier farmers in the west could not easily ship their grains east because of storage problems and a long journey across Pennsylvania, mountains, remember. As a consequence, they distilled their grains into whiskey, which was easier to ship and preserve. Now, the first signs of rebellion. The residents of western Pennsylvania believed the tax unfair to those living on the frontier, and they refused to pay the tax. Summer of 1791. The people of western Pennsylvania began forming an assembly to represent them in protesting the tax. While some called for violent resistance, others such as Albert Gallatin and Hugh Brackenridge hoped to achieve a peaceful solution. In July of 1791, the first major meeting of those opposed to the whiskey tax occurred at the Redstone Old Fort in Fayette County, western Pennsylvania. Fall of 1791. The people of western Pennsylvania chose delegates to represent them in their protest of the whiskey tax. These delegates convened at the sign of the Green Tree Tavern in Pittsburgh and formally declared the tax to be contrary to the interests of their counties. The first bit of violence occurred when a tax collector named Robert Johnson was tarred and feathered in western Pennsylvania. Afterward, arrest warrants were issued for those responsible, as Johnson had recognized some of the attackers. A man named John Connor was sent to make the arrests, but he himself ended up being tarred, feathered, and tied to a tree. May of 1792, as a result of the outcry heard from those living on the frontier, the difficulties and dangers of collecting taxes from that part of the country, and the Western Pennsylvania delegates having petitioned the government to repeal the tax, the whiskey tax was modified to a slightly decreased rate. However, the tax still disproportionately affected the farmers and small distillers in the rural western regions of the country, and their resistance to collection and enforcement continued. July of 1794, many people in western Pennsylvania still refused to pay the whiskey tax ever since it was enacted in 1791, and ever since the first instances of violence against government officials that same year, more tax collectors had been intimidated. Things turned much more serious in July of 1794, when a federal marshal named David Lennox began serving writs to those who refused to pay the tax. July 15, 1794. Lennox enlisted the help of a wealthy landowner and tax collector named John Neville, and the two made their way to serve a summons to a man named William Miller. Lennox and Neville were then surrounded by angry tax protesters, but were eventually allowed to pass, and a shot was fired from the crowd as they rode off. July 16, 1794. An angry mob appeared outside of John Neville's home at Bower Hill and demanded to see David Lennox. Neville fired upon the crowd, killing a man named Oliver Miller. Members of the mob began shooting at Neville's house, but Neville had armed his slaves, who upon his signal began returning fire and forced the mob to retreat. July 17, 1794. A much larger group of hundreds of angry rebels appeared outside of Neville's home to demand Neville surrender. Neville, however, had escaped, leaving his brother-in-law, Major Abraham Kirkpatrick, and a small group of soldiers to defend the property. The rebel mob allowed the Neville women to flee the scene, then opened fire on the house, leading to a gun battle between the rebels and the soldiers protecting Neville's home. At least one rebel, James McFarland, was killed by someone in the Neville house, and the rebel mob managed to burn down Neville's home and other buildings on his property. August 1794. After the Battle of Bower Hill, anti-government sentiment in the region had grown, instigated by leaders such as David Bradford. Around 7,000 rebels had gathered on Braddock's Field near Pittsburgh and were contemplating attacking the city. The citizens of Pittsburgh ejected several residents known to be government sympathizers from the city and offered the rebels a gift of some barrels of whiskey, along with pleas for peaceful conduct. The rebels accepted the gift and proceeded to march through Pittsburgh in a mostly peaceful protest. In response to the recent troubles in western Pennsylvania, President George Washington called for the rebels to disperse and invoked the Militia Act of 1792, allowing the use of state militias to put down internal rebellions. In the fall of 1794, President Washington was able to muster nearly 13,000 militiamen, and he personally led this force into western Pennsylvania after having sent a peace envoy which was unsuccessful in reaching an agreement with the rebels. However, upon the approach of Washington and his considerable military force, most of the rebel leaders fled deeper into the mountains, and Washington's militia was not met with violent resistance. Washington returned to Philadelphia, leaving the militia in the command of Henry Light Horse Harry Lee. A number of suspected rebels were arrested. Only 2 were found guilty of treason, These two were sentenced to death, but were pardoned by President Washington. In 1802, the whiskey tax was repealed by the Jefferson administration. That's it, folks. Hope you enjoyed this little fact, and thank you for watching.